Hey, well, Jake, I just want to start out. I don't know how many people here, had a chance to read your book. Hopefully, most of them did, but I just want to summarize that it is the one nonfiction book about climate that I've read that was actually fun to read and really a page turner. I think it helps to know how to write, to write a book about climate. And you certainly did that. You give examples of many different climate disasters that affected people, and the book really reads like a series of short stories about each of these people and how they got into the messes that they did and what they did to try and get out of them. And it's really each story is very suspenseful about whether the people are going to make it or not, or end up another one of the climate migrants. Maybe you can say a little bit about how you ended up writing this book, what got you to write it, and how you actually did the research and talked to all the people that made it into the book.
Well, thank you so much. And it's cool that in addition to Chase and Heidi, Jessica, that's so neat to see you again. I quoted Jessica. She put in a chat in an article I wrote about Louisiana's climate adaptation policy. And Jessica did phenomenal research, or was doing very interesting research on that, which ties in quite nicely to some of the stuff in the book. And I see you still have a big old map of Louisiana on the wall of your Hudson Valley apartment, which is typical of anyone who's lived in Louisiana. They never quite leave in many ways, it seems. So yeah, so it was about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. I was mostly writing about housing. I was living in New York and writing about housing and homelessness. And I wrote an article about the I actually, this is bad. I don't remember how I first heard about the FEMA floodplain buyout program, where FEMA would you basically purchase flood-prone homes and destroy them and move the people, give the people money to move somewhere else. Um, but I got really interested in this idea of, okay, well, what is the impact of climate change or climate policy on like the urban? I was mostly writing about cities, and so what's the impact on the city? So I went to these like ghost towns in Houston, basically, where the government had moved, hundreds or thousands of people, hundreds or thousands of people out of these specific subdivisions. And I came back from that story with like 10 times as much material as I could use just on that one program. It was just like there was almost nothing had been written about this. Nobody except for one guy at Rice University had ever tried to figure out what happened to the people who left. And that was true broadly. I found across all the disasters that I would, then started to read about or research about. So then during COVID, I had nothing to do. Freelance right, I was a freelancer at the time and was in good work during COVID. So I had a lot of free time. And then a book agent was like, got in touch with me and said, well, what do you ever thought about writing a book? I said, yeah, I've been thinking about that since I was five. So, what's, and we just felt like there was, I mean, it's hard to kind of believe now, but or it's hard to remember, certainly sometimes for me. But back then, there really wasn't that much journalism being done about this issue of climate change and housing displacement, or even the long tail of climate disasters. There just wasn't. And so I just felt like there was like a huge niche to be filled there. And later on, this idea of like, oh, a kind of domestic generation of climate migrants and what are the principal forces, that kind of came later. At the first, I was just like, well, why is no one checking in on these people, basically? And so the book kind of emerged out of that. And the stuff, the aspects of it that are about the long, kind of trajectory of migratory movement in the United States. How long will the Sun Belt continue to grow? Will people ever move away from the coastlines? Those kind of came later and emerged out of, an attempt to scale some of the stuff that I was doing, like in these individual neighborhoods or towns, like the one in Louisiana, where there had been these repetitive displacement events. So that's kind of how I got into it. But yeah, I came at it from the opposite way, I think, of a lot of like environmental climate reporters, where I was writing about the other part of it, the displacement, and then kind of like added the climate angle, and then the climate angle swallowed the entire thing and then became like everything I've done since. So yeah.
It seemed like you followed some of the characters in the book for a long period of time to be able to tell their story. Were you with them for long periods of time, or was this done on, just by interviewing them?
Yeah, this is like the most difficult part of the book because it was manufactured. Like I found these people at the end of their story for the most part. I would go to these places where there had been disasters 4 or 5 or 6 years earlier, and I would find the people who are still living there. That's pretty easy, right? You just walk up to their doors and knock on the door. And then I would find people who had been maybe quoted in a newspaper article 6 years earlier, or a friend of someone who lived in the street, or maybe I used like some of the parcel maps that the counties would have to who used to live in this house, and I'll look up their names. And I interviewed them, and it's really hard for people to remember even memorable things. And you guys know this, right? Like it's really hard to reconstruct someone's exact experience, like with any degree of, I would listen to people tell the same story 3 times and it'd be different every time. So that's kind of a manufactured effect of like, I met this person, I'd met most of these people years after this events had happened, just because the timeline of the book, I had about a year to write it, right? So I had to go back to the 2017, 2016 disasters that had happened back then. And if I wanted to show what's happening to these people. Yeah, so then I try to kind of disguise that by starting this, by telling a chronological story, with over a long period of time. Um, so that's the effect that you're trying to get. But yeah, most people I would meet, they were already close to what you can call recovery, right? Or something like that.
Well, I think you did a fantastic job of portraying these people because it seems like when I read the book, it felt like I knew these people and the emotions that they had gone through over a long period of time after reading your descriptions and the stories that you wrote about them. Um, Towards the end of the book, you make a point that you think people are going to need to rely on government to be able to save them from climate disasters. And I have a couple
Oh.
of questions to ask you in regard to that. The first one is, do you see the Trump administration heading in this direction? And the other is, do you think the most effective way that government will be able to help people is going to be on a federal level or a more local level?
Great question. So yeah, so this year I'm on book leave, and I started my book leave about February, which was great timing because when I was working as a staff writer at Grist, which is this environmental magazine where I've been for the past couple of years, my main beat was FEMA and disasters, and the Trump administration's, well, it's hard to know exactly what their like approach to this is because there's internal divisions within the Homeland Security Department about how to approach this. Some people say, and these voices appear to be winning, that FEMA should not exist and that we should get rid of it. And that if we do disaster aid, it should be either passed by Congress as individual, congressional allocations to specific places, which is how we used to do it, for a long time up until maybe the 50s or the 60s. Um, or we just shouldn't do it at all, and the states should fund it themselves. Certainly, a lot of the federal grant programs that I wrote about in the book, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which funds the FEMA buyouts, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Fund, which funds a lot of the stuff that they were doing in Norfolk, Virginia, in that chapter. The administration, whether legally or not, in some cases it's legal, in some cases it's not, has decided that they're not going to do that. They're just not going to do that kind of work anymore, and they're going to try to make it as hard as possible for other people to do it as well. Um, so all that being said, um, it's possible that the administration would succeed in, dissolving FEMA as an agency to a great extent and distributing money to the states or whatever. What's not going to change, what's never really been in doubt for me, and what I don't really see how anyone could really disagree with, is that the federal government, and this is kind of what I was getting at in the book, the federal government is the only entity that has anything like the amount of money that's required to deal with the kind of disasters that I wrote about in the book. Insurance companies can't, they just can't seem to handle them in the private market. In windstorm insurance companies in Florida have a difficult time. The fire insurance market in California has gone haywire. Those companies, even when they're quite large, like State Farm, can't seem to handle it. The state governments certainly cannot handle it, even in a place like California, because states, as you may know, have to balance their budgets. They have the legal requirements to balance budgets. You can't just spend a bunch of money. Um, and the local government certainly can't do it. And the people obviously can't do it. Homeowners can't do it themselves with their own savings. So that part of, in order to smooth this out, you're going to need to rely on the feds. That's never, I still think that's true. And I think most people think it's true. And I think the only people who don't are either, completely, delusional, or they're just playing with fire and they're hitting the red button of what if, thousands of people lose their homes and the government just did nothing about it? What would happen? Like, no one knows, right? Because like it's never really been tried. We were doing disaster aid in this country as early as 1802. There was a house fire, a series of house fires in New Hampshire, and the people went down to Congress, the 100 of them, and said, "Can we please have some money? We can't handle this." And Congress said, "Sure." And that's ever since then we've been doing it constantly. So yeah, I do think that there's just no feasible alternate, and you need money to deal with this stuff. It's not like you can just have like, good, planning is good, building codes are good. You need money as well. And the federal government is the only entity that has that much money. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on it. But certainly we're seeing an attempt to experiment with what's the minimum that the government could do without, causing an immense, political and social crisis.
Yeah, I guess I really worry about what's going to happen under the Trump administration because it seems like one of their major goals is to shrink the federal government and to certainly reduce funding for a lot of social programs. So, I worry that things are only going to get worse, at least in the short term. Um, One of the things that us folks in mental health have been talking about in regard to dealing with climate disasters is a concept called transformational resilience. And this is an attempt to deal with climate disasters in a public health type of mode, where rather than just responding once the disaster occurs, trying to educate people ahead of time about the nature of climate disasters, the nature of how people respond to stress, what people can do that are living in riskier areas to, build up their resilience in the event of a potential disaster coming to them. I'm wondering if you're familiar with this and what you think about it, whether this is going to be of much help or any help in regard to, the upcoming climate disasters that people are going to be facing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've come across this concept, and I think that um it's interesting because I wrestled with this a little bit in the book because I think there's a kind of temptation for journalists to portray people who are in these situations basically as being, they're basically victims of a really unfortunate event. And in general, there's like an if it bleeds, it leads thing with journalism where we look for the worst cases of the most horrible things happening to people and saying, this isn't this bad. But I tried to shy away from that in the book a little bit, and I found that a lot of people I talked to honestly said that they were doing okay and that the experience, so many people said to me, I actually am grateful for this experience in a way because, I feel like I came out stronger from it. And I had to wrestle with that where at the one hand, I don't think anyone should have to go through this. I wasn't happy for them that it had happened to them. Um, I wasn't really sure that there was a silver lining in all cases. These were really psychologically complex processes that people were undergoing after these things. And a lot of times, for people, especially for like upper middle class, homeowners who had maybe bought their home, they'd paid off their mortgage, they had insurance. The primary effect was psychological. There was temporary financial disruption. There was uncertainty about where they were going to live. There was maybe some, like quality of life effects, depending on where they ended up. But it was actually just psychologically really jarring for people to have to reassess the risk level that they were, of the place that they were at, and maybe say goodbye a little bit to the place that they were living, even if it cost them virtually nothing, financially speaking. So I think that, this kind of preparatory work, to help people understand how to think about risk, understand, what can happen to you when something like this happens, and all the ways in which it's good, bad, in between, confusing, revelatory, like whatever. Um, that's really important work to do. And the difficult part about it, I think, and I haven't done any kind of like research, quantitative or like, authoritative on this, but a lot of people have psychic structures that are very resistant to this. So when you come in and communicate risk to somebody, it's very difficult to do it before the thing actually happens. They just don't want to hear it. And sometimes it locks them into where they live. Say, no, you're not going to take where I'm from. And there's a great anthropological study of, I think, a flooded community, and I want to say it's New Jersey, and it's called "Never Saw It Coming." And it's just never saw it coming. That's I heard that someone said, I just never saw this coming. It's like, well, you were trying not to see it. You know, you were really trying hard not to see it, and that's fine. That helps people get, in their, through their lives. But I think that that kind of work is really important. Yeah.
Jay, can you say a little bit about what the impact of this book has been, what life after the Great Displacement has been like for you, and whether any of your ideas have changed since you wrote it?
Yeah. So it's hard because since the book has come out, I probably could have written it again based on all the things that have happened since. I think I had to stop working on it in 2022. So it came out in 2023. So yeah, I had to stop adding to it and changing it in 2020, early 2022. So it's been 3 years-ish since I had to lock it in. And I mean, I could populate it again with a whole new set of stories of different disasters that have happened since then. Um, I'm not going to do that because that sounds kind of tedious. But I like, and each of those disasters, some of them sort of, seem to affirm or, prove right some of the things I was saying, but some of them work in different ways, like new dynamics emerge. For instance, after the Los Angeles wildfires, I spent a decent amount of time this year in Altadena, which is like the sort of middle class-ish, homeowner renter community near Pasadena that burned. Um, and GoFundMe, they've raised an astonishing amount of money in that community through GoFundMe to the point that it really has slicked up the way of like it's much easier for people to think through some of this stuff about insurance because LA is so famous. It attracted so much media attention. That whole like, and there's tons of celebrities coming through and dropping off stuff. And this is just a totally different. I would have said, right? Like, and I did say to you a couple minutes ago, like, I think that the only way you're going to do this is with government aid. And this was an interesting kind of challenge to that weirdly because it was if you're a famous enough city, like most of them they're not doing well, of course, but they have like cash. The city has an escrow trust fund of like millions of dollars from GoFundMe that they basically can't figure out even how to spend. They can't spend it on home repairs because it's the insurers are supposed to cover that. But yeah, it's amazing. And so there's new kinds of things like the drought stuff has gotten really complicated and changed a lot since then. But I think in general, just because I'm rambling a little bit, I think the biggest change that I'd probably have to make is at the end, I do two sort of cute things, right? One is like I try to give an assessment of how much global temperatures are going to rise and where the state of the world is on climate action. Um, and then I also kind of say, well, the world has really started to, pick up this adaptation stuff. funneling more money into responding to these disasters. We're doing this in a way we never have before. Communities are starting to think about, even if it's at kind of a kindergarten level, about how to, reduce disaster risk. Both those things, I don't know. If I had to go back and rewrite that last chapter, I have no idea what I would say. How many degrees is the world going to warm? I think in that book I said maybe we're going toward 2.5. I don't know if that's true anymore. Could be more, could be less. And the whole thing of, well, now we're funneling tons of money into adaptation. Not really. I mean, the Trump administration shut all this stuff down, but also Europe, they've reallocated tons of their, money to defense spending because of the breakup with the US. They've cut down a lot of this green spending. A lot of these, aid programs and experimental, sort of insurance programs in the developing world that are supposed to help guard against drought and stuff. These all depend on international, overseas development aid and stuff. That's now it's just hard to say anymore that like, well, we've started to make some progress on this. I kind of thought we had, and you can't stop it all, but I don't know. I mean, it would be a little bit and the publisher said, don't make a super depressing ending, so I tried not to, but I would have a harder time fulfilling that mandate if I was writing the book today, to be honest with you. And that's, good thing that's only about halfway through, so we can try to, kick up the mood a little bit toward the end, but that's just the truth. I mean,
Okay. Um, a little bit before I had read your book, The Great Displacement, I had read a book called Nomad Century by Gaia Vince, who actually does take a much more pessimistic view of things than you did. She, warns that on the course we're going right now, we're likely to see a 4 to 8 degree centigrade rise by 2100 throughout the world, and that if that happens, the only habitable places of the world are going to be Canada, Russia, Patagonia, and New Zealand. Um, that's going to be a lot of migration. Is that something that you have in your mind as a possible scenario in the future?
I've read, yeah, I mean, yeah, Guy is great, and I mean, I read with that book with great interest, but I just don't know. I mean, for two reasons, right? One is that, adaptive capability, there's a lot of adaptive capability in the developed world. Like we just have the phenomenal engineering capabilities, like, where I'm living, working on this next book, which we can talk about, or maybe not, in Bakersfield, like they get in LA too, they get their water from 300 miles away. That water is conveyed on the most complex hydraulic system, basically ever designed by mankind. That was designed 60 years ago, before, a lot of the current technology that we have right now. So I do think that, with enough money and political will, it's not necessarily the case that we would have to abandon, New York City, for instance, right? Or Los Angeles. Like these are places that people are pretty invested in keeping. However, on the 4 degrees path, we don't really, there's not any reassuring statement that you could say that would be credible, frankly. Um, so if I'm going to tell you, well, no, we don't have to abandon, 90% of the Earth's landmass, that's not really credible. No one knows what a 2 degrees Celsius world looks like, let alone four. I mean, it's almost beyond, and I mean, we're supposed to try to figure out ways to communicate this. That's part of my job. That's like what, I think kind of woke a lot of people up to the climate issue was the 2017 era, publication of The Uninhabitable Earth and some of the disasters that followed me after. A lot of people, got really acquainted with what 3 or 4 degrees Celsius would look like. But I don't know. There's no way to picture that, honestly. And you can do projections and stuff, but none of I wouldn't say that any of the worst case scenarios are really out of the question. However, I don't really feel confident that I can do any kind of like assessment of how likely or unlikely any given, large scale migration movement is. And to be honest with you, I don't think anyone else can either.
Okay. I'm going to open it up for questions at this point. If you have a question for Jake, raise your hand and Jenna will unmute you. Robin? It looks like, okay.
Well, I'll kick it off, and because I've been thinking about questions to you for a while and have been so uh, involved in your book and think it is incredibly important. And before we all got together, you said you thought it was dated, and I disagreed with you. I think it's bringing very important things to our attention, even if you were to write it with more disasters and people that you describe. But there are some principles that carry through that I think are really important. For me, though, I want to address one thing that sticks in my mind that I've been thinking over and over again. And you've talked about the importance of government is the big government, federal government is the only place that there's adequate resources to manage this. And I think that that's really important. But in your book, you also address the contradictions between staying in place and rebuilding or moving. And it's very clear in those, as I recall them, that people with resources, just as you've described in LA, have the capacity to make choices about whether they relocate or whether they rebuild in delightful ways. And people without that, whose entire wealth is invested in their property that is damaged, don't have those choices and are stuck rebuilding often with the current situation of their insurance plans, giving them the capacity to rebuild. What comes to mind for me is those disparities. And are we creating the situation where we make it possible for people to rebuild, but they are stuck now in places that have recurrent risk of losing their property and wealth and livelihood and lives again? Could you address that contradiction?
Yeah. I think this is one of the most like enduring problems from the book. And I wrote what I thought was kind of like a nice, or I was kind of proud of it, like follow-up essay on this question of at what point do you just say, no, I'm not going to help you anymore. You got to go, you know, because like, A, it's too expensive, right? Or for the government to keep helping you, or B, like for your own good, you don't want to be here, trust me, you know? So who gets to say trust me? You got to get out of here. And what do you owe to the people that are saying get out of here? You got to move. And like I was saying, and this came up when I was talking to Jessica for the story about the Louisiana's quite ambitious and robust, actions on coastal adaptation. They've tried a bunch of different things. We don't even know what works and what doesn't work, in my opinion, in terms of how to adapt to these disasters and how to, build places that are resilient. So how can we say yet this isn't working, nothing can work here, you have to go. Um, there's nothing we can do to insulate you from this risk, or it's not worth our money. Um, and we've done so little thinking about the first thing of what do we even do about this that we're so even further behind on this moral, I think it's mostly a moral question of the government, of the public good versus private perceived good, right? Because sometimes the private good, the good of the individual, is actually against what they think. So the person's right to choose and right to retain the property that they own, that's a recognized kind of principle in our society versus the government's right to say no, the public good is trust us, and there's a confusing legal landscape around this. Um, and the moral landscape is even more confused. And I only barely got started on that in the book. I tried to make some, I talked to a lot of like philosophers after the book to see if I could like write a little philosophical piece about it. But it's really hard. And I don't think I have anything like an answer, honestly, for you on that. Not even close. But it's something that I think everyone doesn't cut neatly across partisan or political lines. It's just like a really hard moral and political question that we're gonna need to find ways of answering.
If you've written a follow-up article, could you let us know what it is?
I'll put it down here,
Okay.
only because I'm proud of it.
Astina, do you have something you wanted to ask Jake?
Oh, yes. First of all, I wanted to confess that I have not read the book yet, but I did order
Okay.
it. And I wish I had known about it before I did my presentation. But I think there's still time to add something to it. I just wanted to know how much of your book is devoted to like actual scientific research and how much of it is devoted to anecdotes of these survivors. And did you include any of the stories of people who were escaping Hurricane Katrina?
Very, very little is devoted to scientific research. And that was kind of maybe not like in retrospect, ideal way of, I basically was just sort of felt like other people, I have read it all, right? And like tried to digest it, but I did very little like regurgitating of the evidence about, I would basically just try to summarize the top line conclusions about the relationship between, you know, global warming and the incidents of the disasters I was talking about, which is not always easy to do in one sentence. And then I incorporated a decent amount of academic literature on the displacement stuff to the extent that it exists, um, there really wasn't a lot of it at the time that I was writing. There's a decent amount. Some of it's quite fascinating. But that more so than the stuff on climate science, I put very little climate science into the book. It was kind of an experiment. I just wanted to see if it would make it any more digestible or like if people could come to it without that and maybe get something out of it. And your second question is about Katrina. Yeah, there's a few anecdotes. I didn't do a full chapter on it. It's a very, very complicated and I mean entire books. There's a great book by a guy named Andy Horowitz called Katrina, A History, I think it's 1915 to 2010. Phenomenal book about the history of New Orleans. Um, and there were a couple anecdotes I read about people who, ended up the sort of long tail of some of them ended up in Arizona or, the weird things where they scattered to the four winds. But it is kind of the case of climate impacts in America. And I would probably say like 60%, Jessica can maybe help me with this. A huge proportion of all papers that have been written about climate disasters in the United States have been written about Hurricane Katrina. Like a phenomenally large amount of research on this topic. And there's a rich conversation we can have about some of that research. So some, but not a lot. Yeah.
Jake, I think you're being very modest about the amount of scientific evidence in your book. As I recall, the last quarter of the book is reference notes. And
There's a lot of notes in there.
I mean, the remarkable thing about your book is that it reads like a novel. It doesn't read like a dry scientific treatise, and it's just wonderful because of that. Chase, did you have something?
I do, and thank you for letting me even ask a question. I know I'm technically not a part of this organization at all, but Jake, I have a two, maybe three-part question for you. So I'm cheating. But first, I'm curious, and also I should disclose I've not read the book. I'm very ashamed to say I've not, but it's in my Amazon cart as we speak. Um, so my first question is. I think something was sparked for me hearing you talk about kind of the relationship between the public and the private, and trying to figure out um, what people's thoughts who have actually been affected by these disasters think about that. So I'm wondering, one, if uh, you heard any solutions from the people who were affected or ideas from them about what they would have liked to have seen happen, perhaps beyond just the stuff of like, well, I want someone to pay me for my house. I want my insurance to pay me out. Um, and then two, I'm also curious about how these folks, just to go back to the role the federal government plays, how they viewed the role of the federal government in these conversations. I think a lot of the time, folks um, obviously have very complicated feelings about what they view as an entitlement or a right for themselves. Um, but have very perhaps the polar opposite feelings when that means when those same rights are transmuted onto somebody else. So did folks talk to you about how they viewed the federal government, and how they thought the federal government owed or what they did not owe them, and perhaps their neighbors or people who are far flung from them. And then lastly, the last question. So I hope you've been focusing on everything I'm saying, Jake. I think a lot of people's work uh, causes them to despair. I'm sure that's true for a lot of folks on this call. Talking to folks who perhaps like have very serious mental health challenges. I am confronted with it myself, as a lawyer sometimes. But I'm guessing, or I'm asking particularly for you, like as someone who has to kind of think about the end of the world a lot, like how do you yourself navigate, feelings of despair, and try your best to, I guess, like stay tethered to this earth?
Okay. For you, all three parts.
God
So,
bless. Thank you.
on the part about people's, what people, there's a variety of, obviously different opinions and viewpoints about FEMA, about the government, about what was causing the disasters that people were experiencing, right? Or how big a deal it even was, frankly. Um, FEMA, in, in New Orleans, they put up murals after Katrina and said, fix everything my ass. That's what you know, people hate FEMA, and because the moment that it happens to you, as you said, it becomes your right to get, and it is, like it becomes, of course the government should be helping me, right? Like, oh, well, I just got my house destroyed. Like, and people, almost never felt like that was being fulfilled. And there's a lot of anger at the government, although there's nobody, and there's every now and then you meet people who say, I didn't even want to take FEMA aid. I just wanted to help get myself up by my bootstraps, right? I heard that a lot of times. But there was very little, disagreement about the idea that you really needed some kind of steady hand here. And a lot of the biggest complaints that I heard while writing the book were partially addressed by the previous administrator of FEMA, Deanne Criswell, under the Biden administration. They rolled out a new sort of program where basically, the biggest issues are in the first couple days, where can you get these people money without sending money to people who don't need it, without basically being defrauded? How can the government get money as fast as possible without being defrauded? Um, and they tried some new stuff. There's these new $600 debit cards. There's like you can get paid to stay in a hotel immediately now. And Trump, he's trying to undo basically everything from the Biden administration except this. I don't know if they're still doing it, but they haven't said that they're undoing it because that would look really bad. So at least to my knowledge, though there's a lot of news. I might have missed it, to be honest with you. So if they did say, it wouldn't be that surprising. So yeah, so there was a lot of anger at FEMA, and a lot of it's procedural more than philosophical. Just this isn't working. This is too slow. There's too many. You have to upload this stuff, like a picture of your driver's license and your home title or whatever, like from your car, like while you're like at a gas station. After this is really hard to do. Um, on the question of like people coming up with their own solutions, I think just when you look at it a little bit longer and people who are in areas of perpetual risk, like Louisiana, coastal Louisiana, or these repetitively flooded communities in like the bottomlands of North Carolina, there was a sense that the government should have a more active and active but also permissive and understanding role in helping people say goodbye to these communities, right? So if we're gonna have to move out of here, this is an issue in this community called Lincoln City. It's like one of the older, maybe like it was founded shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation. Is a very old, like historic Black community that got bought out by FEMA in the 90s. They really wanted to memorialize this. They wanted to put up some monuments. They wanted to like, maybe like turn it into a park or something. They received like no help with this. And there was a lot of sense of like, well, if we have to leave, can't the government help us like gradually? Let's make this like, let's not make this an all at once after, let's plan this. Let's get some community buy-in. That's probably the biggest sentiment. And there's been some attempts to kind of guide this from the bottom up, although none have been all that successful for a number of different reasons. Um, so yeah, I think that like there, as much as there's hatred for the government though, and there really is like frustration, immense frustration with the government, um, there's also like a pretty people really it comes home to them, and not that many people would say like, well, FEMA should be here, they shouldn't be over there, like in that area where there's people who don't look like me. In part because this events turn you into kind of self-centered and naturally they just your world compresses into like what's going on in my community. So I don't know that there was that much talk about like resource and like disparity issues between different disaster prone communities. Although I should think on that because maybe that's wrong. Anyway, the last part, I don't know. I think that I'm attracted to complicated topics, and the more like complex something is, the more it excites me. The more nuanced things are, the more that they excite me. Um, and so this is a really fruitful area in that way because there's an immense amount of research on it. It's constantly changing. You can look at it from a million different angles. And for every person who's telling you that the world is about to end, there's another person who's telling you that, wow, did you know that China installed more photovoltaic solar panels in the last 2 months than the rest of the world has? And this is always, you can get this, like insane statistics on this stuff that are really good. Or, oh, did you know that like Norway has 80% new sales of cars are electric vehicles? Like, oh, I didn't know that. So it's just you just can't have, I don't think you cannot have like a definitive one note statement about this issue. It's just not possible. You can't sum it up in one way and say, where are we? Where are we going? It's this. So that's kind of what makes it easy for me, not easy, but tolerable, is that there's nothing definitive about this topic. And if there was, I probably wouldn't want to write about it as much as I do. Um, so
Okay,
yeah.
thanks. Amelia, did you have something you wanted to ask Jake?
Hi, thanks. I'm maybe 2/3 of the way through your book, and really enjoying it. And it's actually hit home because I'm in Arizona, and actually, as a second question, which we may not have time for, that I'll put first. I'm giving a pitch on Monday for a Big Ideas Challenge, which ours was one of 12 accepted to give this pitches on, and ours is Heat and Health Resilience Innovation Consortium. And so I don't know, it recently, because of the changes in the Trump administration, so I'm a scientist and a professor, and we live on grants. And so now everybody, I'm getting advice at the last minute. Oh, you need to change everything, and you need to take out the word climate or your resilience, and you need to not talk about heat. And I'm like, I can't do it that way. So if you have any thoughts, but it's been very helpful to hear about things like, for example, I was unaware of the degree of loss of cotton fields, and also the cattle in Arizona. So very, very informative. Thank you. But my first question is, so first I'll start with, I definitely go to a negative place sometimes. And for me, that's thinking about Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower. And I hate to say it, but I keep feeling like it's really prescient. And I don't know if you've read it.
Yeah, I've read
Yeah.
it.
And so one of the things I'm thinking about a lot now, in particular in the context of the fact that we're in a record era of income inequality, and and we're on the verge of a big tax cut for the super wealthy to make it even worse. Um, how do you see that impacting the anticipated reduced livable areas in the world? Like, are we in a scenario where the rich people are going to buy up all the existing land and then everybody else is going to have to be serfs? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think so because, well, I mean, like, I- it's really hard. Yeah, this kind of this stuff is hard for me because like you can really see it a lot of different ways. And that book, I mean, you're totally right that I think it took place like this year in the book, right, or last year, like so it's like set in this year, and it's not that off. It's not that far off. But I think that even very wealthy people have an interest in a society that functions at some level. And I think that it's more likely that you see the wealthier places like New York City or something like that, which isn't obviously completely wealthy, but it's very, very well resourced. Property values are high. You see those places find ways to survive, as other places that are very low resource or there's no new investment and they're shrinking already, like rural areas, may be unable to survive. They may just continue to shrink or shrink even faster. So you may see kind of an inequality in place. I think that, it's an open question whether, which places are going to benefit from that and which are not. Phoenix, I don't know if you're in Phoenix or Tucson or wherever, but it's Phoenix or Tucson.
Phoenix.
Okay, yeah,
It's shocking.
it's a
Shocking.
great edge case of this because, well, on the one hand, it's the fifth largest city in America now. And so you would think, well, there's a pretty vested interest in figuring out ways to make that. On the other hand, it's very hot. And eventually that might weigh on people's perceptions of it and on growth and on property values, et cetera. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I don't think that you'll see single individuals though, just because there's so much land in the United States. There's so few rich individuals, and people are only so large, like physically, and their families are only so large. I don't know that you'll see them take whole sections of the country unto themselves. But I do think that you'll see a strong divergence in the fate of different, place A and place B in the country, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Thank you.
We may have time for one more question before Jake has to go. Heidi?
Go
You
for
want-
two.
Okay.
I don't have the last question. So I'm curious, when you interviewed these people, did you get any sense or did they talk about if they felt like what happened to them was an isolated incident of this horrible disaster, or did they link it to climate change? And if they did, was there any sort of you know reasoning to why one person would and another person wouldn't?
Yeah, it varied a lot. The predictors were probably what you'd expect. Person's political party registration seemed to influence how they would interpret the events, even if they lived in the same street as someone else. The difficult part is that, when one person said it's climate change and the next person said, to me, well, it's because the subdivision, the builder who did this didn't put a retention pond in the back. Both of them are correct, in a way. And or just someone else, that person C would say, yeah, it's just bad luck, I just got bad luck. They're all right. And weirdly, some people would get radicalized by these events to, suddenly, oh my God, I really believe in climate change now, especially in the areas where sea level rise is highest. It's very hard to deny if like it's permanently higher, right? Um, and they get radicalized into, oh, well, now I really think this is a big issue and I really want my representative to do something about it. Other people would get radicalized into thinking that, like, oh, the city planning department in my town is really bad and they should be voted out, because they did this wrong, which is also fine, Um, but it doesn't seem to be uniform, and it really seems to be it's kind of hard to, it seems so hard to predict. And this is one of the interesting things, like from a psychological perspective, is the cocktail of someone's personality and life experience really influences how they think about this stuff in ways that are really hard to like treat systematically. Um, which is why the like anecdata part of this like framework here was so compelling, where it's like, well, I'm not saying something about how everyone, I'm just talking about how this one person handled it, because it's kind of all you can say, if you like, what is it, if you've met one person, you've met one person, if you met one climate migrant, then you've met one climate migrant, right?
Beth, did you have
Uh,
something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. I really am enjoying the book so far. I'm also about two-thirds of the way through, and I really like the storytelling way you are, and also sort of the acceptance of people as just people, like that they're going to have their complicated reactions. I think it's really helpful to read that. Um, my question for you is, if you were going to die, I mean, I'm personally kind of struck by the sort of entitlement that, life is going to go on and you're never going to have to change and you're never going to have to move as a kind of basic attitude. And so my question is, if you were going to design a public health intervention that would be like a broad one, like just a basic kind of message for people, what would you what would you put on a billboard?
Such a good question. And the first, the first thing that I like go to is that, maybe just because this is what I've been exposed to, most often, is like FEMA, they tried to find a palatable way of doing this. And what they did was like ready.gov, and it's like 1, 2, 3, I'm ready, I'm prepared, and then they had made like a guy, and his name is like Ready Freddy. I don't know if he's like a whale or like a dog or something. I think he's a dog, and he's like the mascot of like being ready, right? And it's like, ready for what, right? Ready for your whole life to be destroyed, right? That's what they're talking about. Like, and so that one, it's not really working that well. It's the limit, public awareness campaign from FEMA is gonna be limitedly effective, but I can only think that I would probably try to do some kind of, you know, there's two things, right? One is like, in the world that we live in now, it would be something like, change isn't, you can't step in the same river twice, change is inevitable, just, like, just be prepared, to lose everything, and just know that life is change. The second thing, if I lived in a different world, or if I was in control of more stuff, the message would be like, we got you, like, we're gonna be here for you. Like, if the worst happens, we, the government or whoever, we've got your back, we'll help you through it. And I think that if people heard that and it was true, they might be more willing to think about, well, what, as opposed to, we're communicating the risk to you. You could lose your home at any time, and here's the degree of risk that you face, and it's very high. Like, so think about that. People, that's really important to do for all kinds of reasons. Like, you need to communicate risk to people, but it doesn't seem to get them all the way there. And some kind of thing, if I controlled the world, it'd be awesome to have a campaign that was backed up by some kind of actual promise that was like, you're very risky, and don't worry, because if this happens, like, somebody will be there to help you. Um, and that would be like the campaign I'd love to run. It'd be a lie if I was running it today, but you know, that's kind of, that'd be that'd be a good one.
I appreciate the
Before,
answer.
before Bob says goodnight to you, I want to say, I want you running the world.
Yeah, you might be the only person who feels that way. No, no, thank you. I mean, it's yeah, it is a little frustrating to, have, there was a glimmer there for a minute when I was writing the book, and now it's been set back a little bit on terms of actual, you know, forward progress. Although who knows, you know, but yeah, there's a few things I would change.
Jake, before we do say goodbye, can you tell us a little bit about your new project, the book you're working on now?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked because every writer is like, well, the last book, the last book sucks. I'm gonna write this one. And this one's way better. It's about the city of Bakersfield, California, which the two primary industries there are oil and agriculture, large scale agriculture. And in the last 10 or 15 years, the oil production has plummeted. They've run out of water. So the farming is way weakened. And the state of California, with the most aggressive environmental policies in the country, has said, you're gonna stop this. You're gonna stop this oil. You're gonna drastically reduce your agriculture. So then it's kind of like a narrative about the last 10 or 15 years there and sort of following, you know, people as they sort of navigated this transformation. The county planning department, the farm workers, right, the oil guys. So I'm sort of there with all of them as they're figuring out what the new world is going to look like there, or trying to prevent it from coming to pass or bring it about. So stay
Sounds
tuned.
good.
Yeah, I haven't not started writing it yet, so
Okay. You have a publication date in mind for it?
it will start with the numbers 2, 0, and 2.
Okay.
Do you live where you are writing?
I've been there for about, I'm not there right now, but I've been there for about a year or so. I'll probably be there for about another 6 months to a year.
Nice, yeah.
Okay. Well, Jake, I think one of the things I'm going to take away from this discussion that you said was that it's the tremendous uncertainty of the whole climate situation that gives you hope. And I think I'm going to try and make that part of my outlook as well. I want to thank you again for being with us and offering your time and having a fantastic discussion. I encourage all of you who haven't yet read The Great Displacement to do so. It is a wonderful book, and it's a really although it's about a very difficult subject, it's a fantastic book to read because it's so well written and it's really a page turner.
And Jake, also, you had mentioned perhaps you would put your email in the chat because I saw some people wanted to do maybe some follow-up. And
There it is.
thank you is all I can say.
Thank you guys.
I like the banter between you and Chase.
I also want to thank you. And as you say, you're good. I'm going to definitely use your email. So many ideas have been stirred up. But before everyone leaves here, for those people at this meeting now who will be attending the American Psychiatric Association meetings in a week or so, this is not about climate, but healthcare and mental health and Medicaid are under massive attack